So now I've covered a little bit about the data schema. Again, remember guys, you can download this from GitHub. It's going to be there updated as you see it right now. Just go on there, have a little look over the code, mess around with it if you want, improve it if you want. By all means, post down in the comments if you've done something different. Share it with me so I can look at it and yeah, cool. You know, I'm here showing you guys how to do certain things. I'm always open to learning as well. You know, I don't know it all. I just know enough. So I'm open to learn as well. So if you guys got ideas, share it down in the comments. Let's actually discuss it and put it together, right? So now the bit that I'm sure that you guys want to see is the migration bit, and it's again it's very simple because that's pretty much how I like to do things. I like to do things as simple as possible. I mean that's a bit you guys might think differently, but again, so the migration part is again same kind of structure. Got exception folder. I've got a driver folder because with the driver folder at the moment we're only supporting MySQL database, but you could easily use Postgres or SQLite or whatever other database driver that you want to use, and you could pretty much do that with this migration script. And yeah, so without further ado, let's jump into this migration and I'll quickly show you what the different classes are doing. And by always designing by interface, and the first one we're going to be touching on to, let me close these down. First one I'm going to be touching on to is our migration interface, and I've not documented these. As I said, I've been writing it for the past 2 days. I've pretty much just throw it together and so I hope for the best. No, I'm just joking. Just written the interface, and I've got 6 method in there at the moment. So we've got our create migration table, which is obviously going to create that migration table for us, and so like I said, it can hold all those records, all those migration files that we're going to be generating. It's going to store a copy of those migration files for us. Save migration is effectively saving those migration files to that migration table. Get migration is to get in all that record within that particular table, right? Now, I should point out that these 3 methods is the 3 methods that we're going to be implementing within the driver class, because these are the only 3 methods that interact with our data or interacts with a database. Hence why we could create a different database driver to work with this migration script, right? But by default, we're interacting with a MySQL database, right? So these 3 methods is the only method that we've got in our drivers class, which I'm going to show you in a bit. Now, these other 3 methods is what we're going to be implementing within our migration file, right? And the first is create migration from Schema. Now, I hope that pretty much tells you what that method is doing, right? It's creating a migration script from that schema that we've created, right? Which is these files right here. So we're creating a migration from the schema, right? Or locating those migration files is this other method, and the 6th and last method is the migrate method, which does all the heavy work, the heavy lifting to say. Well, they're all doing heavy lifting, but this one is the one that deals with pushing that migration to a MySQL database. So that's the interface. So if we go into the abstract migration, which again, I've always just created an abstract class and I'll implement the interface within the abstract class like so. So I've got an abstract class, and I've implemented that migration interface, and I've pretty much just see what I've done in here. I've got a constructor which is taking in two arguments. We've got a data repository, and we've got the second argument, which is a data schema, which is going to be our schema that we've created, right? Now, on the first iteration of this, when I created it, I was using that second argument, but I'm no longer using that second argument right now. Hence why I've wrapped it in this null check to say if it's null, then we're simply going to ignore what we've got in this within this curly braces. If it's null, we're simply going to just ignore all of this. We're not really bothered about all of that at the moment, right? Which is pretty much how I'm using it. So I will get rid of that at some point, so I won't go too much into what it was doing, right? So because I'm not using it no more. And I've just sort of like pipe the first argument to a class property data repository, right? Which is this property right here. And you can see we've set those three methods within our interface as abstract method, because we're not implementing them within this particular abstract class. We want to implement them within our drivers class. So we set them as abstract method. So our driver class is going to extend this abstract migration class, and these are the three methods that they have to implement. You can see we've taken care of the other implementation of the other three methods within that interface. And the first one that we touched on is that create migration from schema, right? So what we're doing, first off, what we're doing is we're scanning that schema directory, right? And this is part of the changes what I mentioned with this method up here. Initially, I wasn't going to explain it, but initially I was passing in a qualified namespace within my migrate method and generating the files that way, but that had a lot of limitation, as I quickly found out. Hence why I've done away with it, right? And I've pretty much just scanning that entire directory for all the scripts, and I'm pretty much going to generate a migration file from all of these scripts. So if I generate migration based on what's already there, and I add a new one to it, it will also generate a migration file for that script automatically. So I don't need to pass in any arguments to do it. It will just do it once a file is in there and it's got the right structure and everything. It will generate that migration file for us. So that's effectively what we're doing. We're getting all that file within that schema directory, checking that it's an array, because this scan method simply uses PHP scan method, which returns an array of all the files within that particular directory. We're checking that it's an array, checking that there's actually at least one file is in that directory, right? We're checking that it's a valid file, and we're getting the file name from this particular method, get file name, which uses PHP path info method. We're using the PHP path file name flag to actually get the name of the file without the file extension, right? Because I've gone about doing this migration, I've seen a lot of different migration scripts, and they normally go with a naming convention of 0001. But I've not done that to say. What I've done instead is I've taken the namespace and the class name, and I've used a PHP hash function to hash that name, and that's the name I've given to the migration files, right? Again, might be wrong, might be right. If you guys got a different take on that, please let me know. But for the time being, or for now, that's the solution that I've gone with, right? So I've created this variable which is assigned to this particular method at the bottom, which, well, it's not at the bottom, it's in my migration trait. So let me get that, and it's going to be trait. And so that's the get file name method. I said it returns the PHP path info. It takes that file argument and uses that path info file name flag to return the name of the file without the extension. And scan simple uses that scan dir method. I will pass in the path, and I've set the directory as an argument, so we can pretty much use this method to scan different directory. All right, and this resolve migration class is a method that I create to help distinguish between the different migration files that we can create. For the time being, it's only going to be returning up, because up is a method that we use to migrate up to our database, and drop is a method that we use to take some, or drop a table from a database, and change is a method name we use to alter a database table. But for the time being, I've not implemented those functionality as yet. I'm only doing up at the moment, right? So it's effectively just checking the class name to see if it contains that particular string, and returning the string name if the class does contain that. That way I can distinguish the different schema class that might be within that schema directory. But as I said, that's still work in progress that I'm doing. So this filter unwanted elements method, what this is doing is it's removing, because when we use scan directory, it returns an array of all the files within that directory, plus some unwanted characters like double dots and dot. We don't really want that, yeah? So this is what this method is doing. It's looping over those arrays, and it's simply removing any empty space or any dot within that array, and it's just going to return those actual files, and that's it as an array. So that's all that method is doing. And you can simply we'll create some migrate log, and this is simply just echoing out some message with a timestamp of all those migration files, when they start, when they stop, when they start, when they stop, right? This is a trait class that I've used to implement these methods. I could have done it in this main class, but again, I like using traits. I think they're very useful. So I've just implement a method that I can effectively use within any class, within a particular component, right? So that's this direction. That's what it's doing. It's simple getting a string of what direction we're implementing, whether that's up, change, or down. But not to worry about that for now, because it's only going up at the moment. So we create another variable called object, and we're pretty much using this base application di get. Now this is my dependency injection implementation, and this is one way of injecting dependencies. There's different ways of doing it within this actual framework, but I've created a simple method that allows us to inject dependencies just like so. So we injecting the new class name, which is going to be this variable that we've set right here, which is going to be this particular class. So it's going to be app schema class name, which is going to be app schema in one of these classes, right? Is going to be within that name. And remember, we're filtering out that name. We're getting the name of that particular file without the extension. I was simply concatenating on to this app schema, which is the namespace, right? So that's all we're loading, or we're checking that that file exists. if it exists, we're going to create an object of that particular file using our dependency injection. So we're saying if it's not an object, we're going to throw an exception or throw a migration invalid argument exception. And I haven't passed a message in there yet, but I will do, right? Now, create another variable once that check is done and successful. I'll create a variable called schema content, and this is basically going to get the content of that create schema method, right? Can you see we sort of like getting that method from that object that we've created up here, and that's going to be this create schema method. We're going to get the return value, and you can see we've stored it within this schema content variable. So checking that it's not empty. If it's not empty, we're going to get the call. We're going to create another variable called class. That's going to equal to get class. I'm going to pass that object in. What that's going to do is that's going to give us the name of the object. Like it's going to give us the actual name of the object, of the actual class that the object was created from. So we're going to take the name of that file and we're going to hash it using PHP hash function. I'm going to give it this algorithm right here, right? And the second argument obviously is the name of that class which we want to hash, and that is how I'm naming my migration files. So as you can see, I've concatenated it with an M, because you cannot create a class name with numbers. Well, you can create numbers, but the first letter the first character has to be a letter, and that's what I've done, because I can't tell how it's going to hash. I can't tell if it's going to start with a number or a text. So I've concatenated an M, stand for migration, onto whatever is being hashed. So I know that my migration file gonna always starts with an M, a letter, right? So I've created a migration file name. Now I've created, well, now we're going to be putting that migration content into the migration file. We're using PHP file put contents method, and you can see we're getting the root of, well, the first argument of this particular method is the location where that file is going to be put, and we're putting that file, that migration file, within this migration folder, which is empty at the moment. So putting that migration files within this migration directory, which is what we've declared right here, root path, and this migration files, concatenate the class name onto it, and it's going to have a PHP extension. There's going to be PHP files, right? And this property simply points to app migration, which is this directory right here. So the second argument for this file put contents method is the actual content that we want to write to the file that we're creating. And you can see we wrapped it in a method called trim, so we can trim any white space around the content, and we're using an external class or an external method to generate that content for us. And that class, well, that method is taken in a couple of arguments, and it's taken in the hash class name as the first argument, the new class name as the second argument, the actual content and direction, right? And at the end of this particular method, we're calling that log method. I'm going to pass a message in that says the file was created successfully, something like that. So going down to the next method, which is the locate migration files, it's a simple method which is using the scan method to scan through a particular directory, which is going to be the migrations directory, and returning whatever file was found as an array, right? Now, our next method that we've got is called migration differences. Now, the purpose of this method is to always return any difference between what we've got in our database and what we've got in our migration directory. So if we add a new migration file within our directory, it will know that that file is not in the database, and it will present that file for us so we can migrate it up. That is simply what it's doing, or simple all that it's doing. The migrate method is the last method, well, not the last method in this class, but the last method from our interface, and this pretty much is doing the migration to our database. And the first call that we're doing is we're creating that migration table, right? And the second line was sort of like creating a variable called migration, and we're removing all those unwanted elements from the array, or from the migration differences, so we've only got the files to deal with, right? I can pretty much even get rid of this, because at this point we won't need to deal with any dots, because it's already been removed from this method, this filter unwanted elements method. So I've created a property called this migrate class, and it's pretty much going to get the name of the actual current migration file without the file extension, right? And our next property that we've got is this migration, which is an array, which is going to get an array of all those migration files without the extension, right? Now we need to create objects, or create objects of those migration classes, so we can actually call the methods that is in those classes. And they have got methods, like you can see. I haven't got a migration file, so I can't show you the methods, but the methods you're going to find within those migration files is up, down, and change, right? So we're checking that the migration class exists using a variable called new class name, and we're checking the namespace app migration and this migration class, which is going to be the migration file that's been generated, and we're going to call it without the extension, right? Which is what this method right here is doing. It's returning the class name without the file extension. So from that, we're going to create a new migration object. We're going to pass it through our dependency injection, like what we did with our schema classes, right? And we're going to check that it's an instance of the migrate interface, which is a interface that contains contains three method, which is the up, down, and change, right? So check that it's an instance of that migrate interface class. If it's not, we're going to throw an exception, and again we're going to start logging information using this from this. Well, we're going to log text or log messages around this execute migration command method, which takes in two arguments, which is that migrate object and the direction. Now I've pretty much just delegate different parts of this method to different methods, so I'm not writing all of these code in this one method. So you can see we've got execute migration command, which is going to be a method we got down here, which takes in that migrate object with the migrate interface type inted and the direction, and all we're simply doing is calling that migrate object and calling the method onto it, or the argument direction onto it. But remember what I said, by default the only direction we're doing is up, so this is always going to return up, right? Until we implement the next two method, which is down and change, then we've got that variable. It's going to be dynamic. It's going to change accordingly to what we're doing. Well, that's the idea anyways. And you can see I will show you where these are coming from in a minute once we look at the driver class, but you can see we've got access to our database without actually creating any database, because if you've been taking part in this from the get-go, you'd have seen that we've got a small ORM which contains all of our database logics, all of our repository entities, and all of our CRUD operation. So when we're doing stuff like this, we don't need to write any database functions. We can simply simply use the components that we've already built to access that database, which is what we're doing right here. And I will explain this to you once we get into the driver section, right? And the last method, which is also an helper method, is this execute migration, and this is what is going to save that migration to the database. And you can see we got save migration, which is a method in our interface which takes one argument, which is an array, which is going to get the name of the migration field, and it's going to store that migration record in, right? And you can see we wrapped it in an array map. So if we're implementing multiple migration files at the same time, it's just going to loop over all of those files and add the migration name to migration name field, right? And all these little constants I've declared at the very top, and all they contain is just messages that get output to your terminal when you run the scripts. And I must say that this is not like a command line scripts. All we're doing is we're simply using our terminal to execute a couple of files, right? So that's the simpler migration class that I've written, and I'm going to show you the driver, and then I'm going to show you how it works by executing a couple of scripts and generating some migration files from those schema objects or those schema classes that I've already created. So this is the migration driver class, and you can see we extend the abstract migration, and just like all of our models, we've declared some table schema, declare table schema ID, and the name of our migration table is migrations, obviously, and the primary key is going to be ID. And you can see we've got a third property, and it's an object called data layer client facade, and that's going to give us access to internal component that we can use to access our database within our component, right? So let me touch on this very quickly. So in my core directory right here, I've got this data object layer, and this does all the database interaction. And I've got this client repository, and the idea behind this is to allow other components in the core to interact with the database, right? And I've got this data repository, and this allows our application side or front end side to interact with the database. So that's what that is. I've done a video on this already. I think some of the very first videos that I've done. So if you really want to sort of like have a look at that, I'll put a link of that particular video in the description, so you can go back and you can have a look at that and see what it's doing. So you can see that we've got our constructor, and our constructor takes in one nullable argument, which is that data schema, which is what I said I'm no longer using. So not to worry about that, because I won't touch on that again, because I said that I'm not using it. So what we're doing is we are instantiating that data client facade. We're passing in these two this contains three arguments, which is going to be, if I put my mouse over it, you can see what I've got is an identifier, a table schema, and a table schema ID. So I'm going to use the table schema as the identifier, which is what I pass as the first argument. The second argument is going to be the name of the table, and the third argument is going to be the primary key of that particular table. And once we do that, we can now access our database, and that is as simple as it is, because we've done a lot of the hard work already in that data object layer component, and that's it. We don't need to touch any database files. We now got access to our database, and the only arguments that we needed to do that was the database table name and the primary key, right? So the create migration table, you can see all it is, we're just creating a migration table, and it contains a couple of rows. We've got ID, migration name, created that, modify that. We've got the primary key set to ID, and we've got a unique key set to a migration name because we want all migration files to be unique, right? And we just set a database engine to InnoDB, and to access our database, we just simply say this client repository. We're going to get the client repository. We're going to get the client CRUD and get the mapping, and we're going to call that execute or that exec method and pass that create, which is going to be this string. We're going to pass that into this execute method, which is going to create that database table for us within our given database, right, which is already set up through our environmental file, right? So let me quickly show you the steps of what we're doing. Client facade, which is this client facade method. You can see that's the 3 arguments that we require, and that's the get client repository method, which is simply going to be calling our factory method. Yeah, so it's simple calling our client factory method, which is creating that object for us, right? So if this is out of the scope of this particular little video, but I want to just actually put some context on what this is doing. So if I go back up to my client repository, get the factory, and you can see what we're doing with the factory. We're simply using that data repository which we've already created, which already got access to the database, and we're simply using that to create a layer that we can use to access the database from our component side, right? So we're never really having to have to directly invoke any database component, any database feature. We simply call the object that we've created or the classes that we've created that's already hooked up. It's already been hooked up, right? So a little bit, I said I'm gonna put a link in the description for the data component or a data object layer video, so you can go back, you can have a look at how I set that up. I pretty much was building that from scratch, so you will see step by step what I was doing and how I was doing it. So that's what that is doing. It's giving us access to this get mapping, which is this data mapper class, data mapper folder, and within that we've got that exec function, which is something that I've just literally added in right there, and it's simply just getting our database connection and calling that exec, which is a PHP function, by the way, and it's taking that statement in, which is going to be our table, and it's going to create that database table for us. So save migration, same jobby. We got that create method, but this time we're in our get client CRUD. You can see we went a step further and get the mapping. We save a step, but we're now in our CRUD object, which we can call a create method, which is going to create those migration fields for us, right? And simple, again, in our get migration method, we've got an optional conditional argument, which we're not using, but we can if we wanted to, and we're using that raw query because we've got raw query as a method within our CRUD class, which you can pass raw query in. And the second argument of this raw query method is any conditions that we want to filter the query by, and the result types that we want to get. Now we can get a lot of different results type, and we could set that as a third argument, but for this particular component we want the columns return type, and it's going to return an array of migration name for us, and that's it. It won't return created by or modified date. It's just going to return an array of migration names as an array, right? That's it. Now, these are the 3 methods that you can implement in a different driver, and because it's the only method that interacts with our database. And that's it. That's all migration script. That's all little migration script. Again, we've got exception, which is extending from our base exception classes. They're not really doing much, just extending from our base exception classes, and I'm calling them in certain places which I've already gone over. So that's all the exceptions. We got the abstract migration, which I've been over, migration traits. So this is the migration traits, and this is where I'm generating or creating those migration files. And there's different ways you could do it, but this is the way I've gone with for now. And we're simply creating the head of our file. So you've got your PHP start, we got our declaration of strict type. Where is that? It's going to be right here. We got our namespace. We got the interface that we're using, and we got our class, which is going to be the generated class name for us, which is going to implement that migrate interface. And it takes in two arguments: class name and original class name, which is something that we are also passing in, because remember, this is going to be an hash value, and if you look at it as it is, you won't be able to tell which file it's being generated from. I mean, you'll probably be able to work it out, obviously, but this original class name is the original namespace of the class, which I'm passing in, so you could quickly look at the file and say, yep, it's been generated by that particular class, right? So I've got the head and I've got the closing tag, which is that closing brace, and within this write class method is where I'm generating all the methods that or migration file are going to be containing. And I said, don't worry about the down method for now. All I'm going to be focusing on is the only one we're going to be looking at is this up method, right? And I've got a external method which takes in a couple of arguments, which is doing the method for, well, which is generating the methods for us, which is what you can see right here. So we've got the dot block, we've got the public function, it's got a name, return type of string, and we've got the schema content. We're saying the schema content isn't null, then return it, else an empty string, right? Just like so. So I'm going to actually generate some of these files so you can see exactly what they look like. But before I do that, actually, there's a couple of stuff that I missed out that I wanted to show, and that is one of them was in my data schema. I think I didn't show you guys the traits. Again, the traits are simple classes which allows us to set keys, set primary key, set reference, do all constraints. Again, if you look at all the GitHub files, you'll see it. We're simply setting keys and returning them so we can use them as chaining methods when we're working with constraints, which is also something I've not shown you within one of the schema classes, which is something I'm going to go back and show you before I generate any kind of files, so you can see what we're doing there. So you see we've got foreign key, just setting the foreign key, returning this. That's pretty much all we're doing within this data schema trait. And we've got a data schema types trait as well, which is where we're building out those fields before we concatenate them, right? Or you can see we could set defaults. For default, we've got none, which is going to be an empty string. We've got a null, which is going to set default null. We've got CT, which stands for default, default to current timestamp, and by we're going to set our own default using that actual default argument, right? That's pretty much what this trait file is doing, right here. And we've got the validation for all the different columns as well. So for index, for example, we can set primary, unique, index, full text, and these are all stuff I've got from MySQL. I did not make these up, right? So same thing for attributes. We've got binary, unsigned, zero fill, unupdate, current timestamp. These are all stuff that I've got from MySQL to implement these into my component. So let's close that. Migration trait, abstract migration. I think I've been through all that. And in our schema, we're going to show you a pivot table. So we got a permission schema, we got a role schema, or we got a role permission schema. And this is the pivot table. This is like a linking table that links both role and permission together, right? So this is our pivot table, and you can see the structure is the same as all of our other schema. We got two roles, role ID and permission ID. But what we got differently in this build method, we've got an anonymous function which is returning more schemas like the keys, and we also got a method that called set constraints, right? This add foreign keys to our table that links this pivot table to the tool table that it's linking. So the set constraint method also uses a callback, or we can use an anonymous function to declare our schema. Within that anonymous function, we've got access to the trait object, which we can then use to call all the methods that I've just been through. So if I bring that back up again, this one, so this set constraint, it's a callable. We're going to throw an exception if it's not valid, and we're going to pass the current object into the callback argument, which is what we've got in this function right here, this anonymous function. The only argument is that trait object, and by passing that in, we can access all the methods that we've got set out in that trait, right? All these methods, we can call them or we can chain them, because they're all method that can be chained as well. And you can see the first method that we use is the add model, and this takes one argument, which is the qualified namespace, or the qualified name for the model that we want to actually link to, and we'll pass it in just like this: role model : class, and then we call on our foreign key on, which is going to get the model, which is going to use this actual argument that we pass into this add model, which is what I'm going to show you what it's doing. Add model, which takes in that model, it passes it through our dependency injection, and we are piping that object to this property, to this class property, so we can, and we then return it in a public function, that object, right? So we can then call get model, and we can get the schema, which is going to return the name, the database name for this particular model, and it's also going to get the schema ID as well, right? And we can use it just like this, and no matter how we use it, once we're passing in this model on this particular chain, it will use the information on this particular chain, right? Because you can see that we use get model, and we use it twice down here, because we've declared add model, we've added another model, permission model. We can then use get model again, which is going to get the schema for this actual object, for this class, and it will get the get schema for this particular class, or we're using it. So that's the actual, that's how you add schemas or add constraints to a pivot table or a linking table, right? So I've taken care of all of these for you, so you can pretty much declare them according to how you want your table, and it will just generate. So I've shown you that. Obviously there's a lot more to it, and I've already gone nearly 2 hours into this video, so I'm gonna have to edit it like crazy to get it down to a reasonable amount of time. So the last thing to do now is to generate those migration files so you can see what they look like. So if I close these down, I will show you my database again, so you can see that I've got no file, I've got no tables in there. So this is what my database looks like. It's empty at the moment, got nothing in there. So I'm going to generate these files, and you're going to see them appear within that database. So first thing we're going to do, let's close all of these down because we're not using them at the minute. So you can see we got 7. Right, before I actually do that, because I actually want to touch on something before I carry on. Just remembered it. So, we've got these pivot table. I'm going to take them out of this directory because how pivot table works is if I execute it like this, it will work, it will be fine. But once I try to migrate it, I might get an error because a pivot table links 2 tables together. Now those 2 tables would need to be, or would already need to be, in the database. You cannot link tables that doesn't exist. You'll get an error, and that's not an error coming from my script. That's going to be a MySQL error, right? So I need to actually take these out and then create these migration of these normal tables and then put them back and then run the script again, which is also going to demonstrate to you that we can add stuff as we go along and generate and migrate. So I'm going to put these in to a different directory for now. Let's put them in this route directory. Move them in. I've got 2 pivot table. One is called user role schema as well. Yeah. So now I'm left with 5 normal tables that I'm going to generate a script for, and then push them to the database. Then get my pivot tables, generate scripts for them, and then migrate them to the database. So without further ado, I'm going to show you what I'm going to be doing. And again, I missed out something again. I'm going too quickly and I'm missing out stuff. So before we do that, let's go to this directory. It's called Magma, and it's in the core directory. And I've got 2 files that I'm going to show you. There's 3 files, but there's only 2 that I'm going to be showing you. Now the create file is the one that creates all the migration files, and the migrate is the file that pushes or migrate those migration files to our database. So if I open up create, you can see all we're doing is we're loading in Composer, and we're simply loading in our migration or migration MySQL file, which is a database file, and we're calling that, we're instantiating it, and we're calling the create migration from Schema method, and that is going to generate all of those migration files for us. And the next one, again, same thing. We don't need that argument there because by default it's going to migrate up anyways, right? Same jobby. We're getting our composer file so we can use a namespacing to get our migration MySQL class. We're going to instantiate it. We're going to call the migrate method. Again, this is not like command line stuff. This is simply using the terminal to execute some files, right? So that's what I wanted to show you. The drop file is simply calling migration with the argument down, which is going to drop something. But I'm going to do a separate video on that particular one when I finish implementing it. So I'm going to get my terminal, just like so, and I'm going to say PHP Magma, which is the Magma directory, / and I'm going to call create.php. Enter, and you can see we've pretty much created those files without errors, right? So we've created all these files. So let's look into our app directory and our migration directory. You can see we've got all 5 migration files that's been generated for us by calling that little command, right? Now, I can't tell you what is what until I open up one of these files. So if I open the first one, you can see the file generated from app schema, user schema, which is going to be this class down here. So if we look in it, you can see we got the name, we're implementing that migrate interface, we're calling that migrate interface, we got our namespace directory. you can see we got our dot block, and we got that app schema, user schema again, the file that is being generated from. And this is the SQL code that we've written from our schema, from this schema, and it's generating this for us, right? So we got our ID, intent, unsigned, auto increment, not null, first name, varchar 190, not null, last name, email, gravatar, status. You can see we got our unique key. We've got 3 unique keys. We've got our primary key, and we've got that little bit at the end, which I showed you back in one of the component files. So this is what it's generated in that up method, right? Because the direction by default is going to be up. You can see we also generated a down method, which is empty. So when we come to implementing that down functionality, we're going to be adding that SQL statement to this method. Same for change as well. We're going to add that change method in here. We're going to put the code in if we want to modify this particular query or this SQL query. So again, looking all of them, you can see it generated all the queries for us. We got roles, we got settings, we got permissions, and you can see we've also got remembered logins. So that's all the SQL query that has been generated from our SQL files. So again, I'm going to quickly show you my database. You can see nothing's happened. If I switch my screen, you can see nothing still happened because all we've done is generated those SQL files, right? So go back to the code editor, and I'm going to execute that migration script. I'm going to say PHP Magma migrate.php, enter, and that's pretty much gone through right away. So we've generated 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 database tables. So if we go back into our database, switch my screen again, and let's reload. You can see we've got all them database tables that we've just generated from our migration files, right? Obviously we've got our migration table, which is the first table that's created. We've got a permissions table, remembered login, roles, settings, and users table. If we look at the structure, you can see that we've got our primary key, which is our ID, all the unique keys that we've set, which is email, password reset hash, and activation token. If we look at again, these are all normal tables, so I'm going to actually go ahead and put those 2 files that I've taken out. Now I'm going to regenerate my schema files, and I'm going to migrate those additional 2 files to my database. So you can see we've created these tables. Our migration script has created these tables for us. So I'm going to switch my screen again, back to my editor, and I'm going to just put these 2 files that I've taken out, put them back into my schema, and then do this all over again. So I'm going to put that back down here. I'm going to put that back down here as well. Right? So I'm going to execute this create.php file again. Yep. So we should now have 2 additional files. You can see we've now got 2 additional files, obviously, as I just said. So let's try and find where those files are. So this is one, user role. You can see the query for it. It's got all the foreign keys set up for us because we've done that within our component. And where's the other one? The other one is role permission as well. So again, similar thing. I'm going to execute that migration script again, and you can see it only executed those 2 files. So starting migration, migration completed, starting migration, migration completed successfully. That's the only 2 files that it knows does not exist in our database. So that's the only 2 files it's going to migrate. So switch my screen again, go back to MySQL, let me reload, and you can see we've now got those two additional tables. That's role permissions and user role, right? And these are our pivot table. If I look at the structure, you can see they've got no ID, they've got no primary key, because that's how a pivot table works. They don't normally have an ID or a primary key, because it's simple just linking or role table or roles table on our permissions table together. So if I look at the relational view, you can see all the constraints that we've added in. So we've got role ID, which is the role ID column between this pivot table. We're linking it to the roles table to the ID column. Same for the permission ID, linking it to the permissions table on the ID column of that particular table. Right? We've written all the schema to create all of this for us, and I hope you guys see this. And you could create your own schema for your own database, and you could go through this process and create it just like what I've done. But that's it for this video, guys. I hope you sort of like that one. Again, all the files are on GitHub. Download it, do whatever you want with it. Put it down in the comments. Let me know what you want to change, what you want to see different. Let's discuss this particular component and see if we can improve it, or add bits and bobs to it. So that's gonna be it for this video, guys. Thanks for watching. Sorry it's been so long. I've been busy. Trust me, I've been really busy. I've got this week off, Easter week, so I can try and get a couple of videos out. I've got my daughter with me, so I can't just sit down and churn out videos, because I've got to handle business right there. So I've had a little bit of time. I've been doing this migration script. I wanted to get to a stage where I feel comfortably enough to put it on video so you guys can see it. So I've done that now, so hopefully I can get a couple more videos churned out. I know I've had a couple of requests in regards to stuff like what's the component that they were asking for, that middleware component. I am doing a video about that to show and implement, or show how I've created it, and other little videos as well. So stay tuned, guys. I hope you enjoyed that one. I did. Stay tuned, subscribe if you have not already subscribed. Thanks for everyone who's already subscribed. Like, share the video, and check back in for the next video coming up. Thanks. See you later.